Next we have Chris Armstrong, and you can go ahead and put up your slides while I talk so we can get as much time as we can. Mr. Armstrong, President of the Armstrong Process Group, is an internationally recognized thought leader in enterprise architecture, formal modeling, process improvement, systems and software engineering, requirements management, and agile development. Mr. Armstrong represents APG at the Open Group, the Object Management Group, and the Eclipse Foundation. Mr. Armstrong is a co-chair of the TOGAF Certification Standing Committee, NDA Capability Improvement Project, was a significant contributor to TOGAF 9, and is contributing to the next version of TOGAF, currently under development. Mr. Armstrong is also on the UML 2.5 Revision Task Force at the Object Management Group. Mr. Armstrong is certified in TOGAF, Archimate, OpenFair, UML, and SysML. So we'll welcome Chris, and you go ahead.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Sorry for all the effort. This is an architects conference, so there's bound to be a little bit of that. So welcome everybody. I'm going to talk just a little bit about understanding reference models and reference architectures. I guess the rationale for this is I think we find ourselves using these words very frequently in practice, but when I take a look at how a lot of our clients, people we interact with, there seems to be a lack of consensus about what those things are, what they really mean, and if they are related. I see some overloading of some of the terminology. So the idea is wanted to try to represent what, at least from observation as well as best practice, what are some of those good approaches. Using reference models as one of the typical usages is to categorize architecture content for different purposes, such as planning, lifecycle management, gap analysis, alignment across the enterprise. Talk a little bit about how reference architectures are used and how they're different but related to reference models. Throw in a little bit of enterprise architecture TOGAF stuff, so some of you folks may be familiar with the idea of a solution and architecture building blocks, which are kind of squishy concepts in TOGAF, so we'll kind of see how they fit in. And for those of you that know me or have seen some of my other talks, one of the things I just cannot help doing is I have to build a model. So I have a conceptual meta model of reference models and reference architectures, which brings up a good question. Is that a reference model of reference models, or is it a reference architecture, or is it a meta? I don't know. All I know is that often I claim that I'm in the middle of the meta model low and I can't get out. Stephanie, I think you did a great job introducing me in APG. One thing just to throw in there is that say one of the things that we've got to offer is from a perspective is we are ultimately helping organizations implement architecture capabilities, whether it's at the enterprise level, systems level, or software level. But we're also partnering with a number of tool vendors, including Smart Systems and IBM Rational. So one of the perspectives that we bring to bear, as many of you guys probably have to do, is how do you do this in the real world in actual tools? Because of course, when you do stuff in PowerPoint and Word and Excel, as you probably know, Microsoft Office is the world's most popular architecture tool set. You can get away with anything as far as what a box means and what a line means. When you try to do stuff in tools, you actually have to make some sometimes arbitrary decision about what these are and try to make things work. So, there's a lot of slides in the presentation. There's really two key slides that I hope try to sum up the perspective that I'm trying to get at here. But I didn't want to just jump right into that at the very beginning. You wanted to really try to make a case for that this is relevant. So did a real quick survey across industry about what is a reference architecture, what is a reference model. But I don't always want to suggest that this has been an exhaustive search. It certainly hasn't been peer reviewed. So if there's things that I overlooked because I just didn't find them, or if I've misstated anything because I looked at old versions of content, please don't hesitate to let me know. But let's start with our wonderful hosts here, Software Engineering Institute. So off of the website, the Software Architecture Glossary, a reference model is defined as a division of functionality into elements together with the data flows amongst those elements. What do you guys think of that? I'm not sure I know what that means. and what I find particularly interesting about this one is the idea of data flow. Not that that's a bad idea, but again, data flow is not something I really think of being as a part. reference model. And then a reference architecture, again, being the focus on software, and not surprising that it's positioned as a reference model that's been mapped onto software elements that implements the functionality defined in the reference model. And I think that seems to be a little bit closer to what I think a reference architecture might be. Let's take another look at a different body of knowledge, TOGAF. Much to my shock, being a member of the architecture forum and contributing to TOGAF, a little embarrassed that it sure looks like we really don't understand this at the Open Group. Because although I do think there's some substance to the claim here that the terms reference architecture and reference model are thrown out there as if we all agree and understand what they mean, but perhaps we really don't. And so the case that TOGAF uses that a reference architecture and a reference model are similar conceptually between an architecture and model. But I'm not sure I know what that means, because of course we build models of architectures. And goes on to say that they can be either generic or organization specific. But I think that the second to last bullet does talk about the idea that a generic reference architecture should give you kind of a starting point and an outline of what things might be appropriate when you're trying to put together what's called an organization specific architecture. When we go look at the actual TOGAF glossary, there's a direct reference to the OASIS, so a reference model definition of a reference model, so that's encouraging. And then for those of you that do work in this space, I'm just curiosity, how many people are familiar with this OASIS reference model and reference architecture? And so therefore you may have an advantage over me because I know enough about it to talk about it, but I don't work in that space perhaps as much as you guys do. But what I thought was pretty positive to see that at least OASIS had gone through some trouble to try to figure out what these things were and write them down. And the definitions, I think, are pretty easy. So a reference model is an abstract framework for understanding significant relationships among entities. For the use, it makes a lot of sense. An OASIS for developing standards or specifications consists of a minimal set of unifying concepts and other things within a particular problem domain that's independent of standards, technologies, and other details. But this is actually something that I find is not perhaps totally correct. Because, and I think you guys probably see, I've seen lots of reference models that are technology specific. And maybe not technology specific. Well, we can even to a platform. Maybe there's Java reference architecture, right? Java reference models and cloud computing reference architecture. So again, we do want to be typically independent of implementations, but I'll make a little case that maybe that's not always true. But ultimately, the OASIS gets down to the idea that a reference model is really trying to define a common language for describing this topic of SOA. But again, it really doesn't get into the details about implementation. So this seems to indicate that one of the uses of a reference model is to agree upon a common language. And that's words that we use for this, at least in our practice and in TOGAF, is we sometimes call that a content meta model. So a meta model is a common language. Some people might use the word ontology. Again, I think there's some opportunity to provide a little bit more clarity. And I'm going to show you again some models that represent that way we're looking at it. We go out and see some actual applications within industry. We look at federal enterprise architecture as a consolidated set of reference models. Borrows significantly from the OASIS definition. But it starts off kind of with an interesting one, the structure which allows modules and interfaces as a system to be described in a consistent manner. Again, I'm not sure if that really does it for me either. But here we just have a quick example of what is a reference model. So this is out of the SOA RM specification. And this is just, again, a subset, but the idea behind it is it's really trying to identify in the context of some business/IT domain, what are the important concepts that we're, in language we want to use to try to limit the scope and just anchor ourselves into some arbitrary language. So the whole idea here is, as you would be surprised, service is the center of the universe. This is particularly the domain, what I would call a domain model, what they're calling a reference model, around service description. So service has a service description that has something to do with visibility through reachability. There's an interface that is a part of that description. And when we come to interaction, a part of that description is its behavioral model and its information model, and a couple of other things. And what we'll take a look at in just a little bit is then how this reference model is then used in the reference architecture as a basis for, again, scoping and the choices for words. But then let's take it to, quote unquote, the real world. I apologize for the small font here, but it's hopefully at least demonstrative. This is an actual, technology reference model that we helped build at one of our client or user organizations. And again, this is around technology. And what we see here is basically a two-level hierarchy of what they call technology areas and technology categories. So we've got stuff that has to do with document management, and database, and security. And then within security, we've got stuff like cryptography and firewall and intrusion detection. So this is, again, some evidence, at least based on practice, that one feature of a reference model seems to be taxonomies or hierarchical descriptions of content. And then here we have an example of how that taxonomy is actually used in trying to categorize an actual set of real technology assets at an organization. So we got the same sort of thing. We got, here's one technology area, application development, design, and testing. That's been decomposed into a number of finer grained categories. And again, that really represents the reference model, in this case, this two-level hierarchy, which of course goes on and on for about 50 pages. But then one of the ways that a lot of organizations use a reference model is to, again, categorize actual things that exist within their organization. So these are, of course, different versions of different products and some disposition about their life cycle. So the whole idea that, in the case of Rational Software Modeler version 6, that's in retirement. We're trying to contain RSM 7, but we consider RSA 7 standard. Of course, now there's RSA 8.5. But just out of curiosity, how many people have seen reference models exploited this way in the work that you guys have done within your organization? So not too atypical. And then we've actually, some of the people might recognize this based on just some of the graphics. This is some work that we did in IBM Rational System Architect, taking what we saw in the previous slide, coupled it with the slide before, to basically try to, again, highlight graphically what are the different assets as it relates to different technology groups, and then just displaying their disposition using some color coding about their life cycle. But then we go on, one of the things that I like to demonstrate when we're talking about this in a lot of the training and consulting work that we do, the tooling work that we do, is who'd have thought, I didn't know about this until I found it late last year, is that the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, which is not what we necessarily think is the most innovative organization, and of course has had some challenges the past number of weeks, it has a really pretty decent technical reference model. So if you're interested in diving in a little bit deeper about what one looks like, again, just another example that we have, in this case, 3 levels of hierarchy. Not, this top level isn't much different than what we saw with the client one earlier, and then some allocation of products to this. And what's interesting about the way that they exploited this is, you can click on one of the products. This is the TRN entry for JBoss application server. Some good content that really is, again, around the product and its lifetime. And I guess no entries in here about end of life and when it's not going to be supported. But then at the bottom, you see here the idea that we've indicated in the context of what a lot of people call an architecture roadmap, showing how the disposition of architecture assets are changing over time. And one of the things I found particularly compelling, and this is maybe something that the federal government can get away with, is they went to these things to say, well, not only are things, provisional, standard, contained, retired, they're absolutely prohibited. Don't even think about bringing that kind of stuff in. And then, of course, we got the federal enterprise architecture, which is ultimately a collection of integrated reference models. There's 5 of them, one for strategy, one for business, one for services, one for data, and one for technology. And here over on the right, we see an excerpt of kind of the meta model of the service reference model. That's, again, a 3-level hierarchy of domains, types, and components. And here we just see an example of what that hierarchy looks like. And this one, despite being for the federal government, because it's back office services, I think is something that can certainly be exploited by non-government agencies as well. And then we got TOGAF, and TOGAF has this concept called the enterprise continuum. And the enterprise continuum, was a real big deal in TOGAF 8 and earlier because there really wasn't this a clear specification of what we call an architecture repository. And I'll be getting to that in just a little bit. But it still has some, so it's been kind of, hasn't been really deprecated, but it's been diminished in its importance in the TOGAF 9 standard. But it just still has some pertinent, relevant concepts. And one of the ideas is there's two parts of the enterprise continuum, the architecture continuum and the solutions continuum. The architecture continuum is where we put what TOGAF calls architecture building blocks. So these are things that we use to compose architectures. And there's, again, the reason it's called a continuum is because there's this spectrum of either reusability or fit for purpose. So things on the left side of the continuum tend to be highly reusable because they're more generic and more commodities. But then because they are so generic and commodities, they require more work to actually reuse them because you have to pick all the right ones, figure out how to put them together, and that requires more effort. And as you move more towards the right, things become more specific, more fit for purpose, which means they become more easier to reuse in the context in which they were designed. And then, correspondingly, the architecture continuum is supported by the solutions continuum. And the differentiation here is that these are really thought to be, it's one of the key characteristics of an architecture building block, is that it describes how it's aligned with a standard or a specification. So as you might not be surprised, an architecture building block by itself doesn't do anything. It identifies a set of requirements, whether that's aligned with an industry standard spec, other certain types of properties and characteristics, but it's actually up to solution building blocks to be the implementers of the behavior and the requirements that are in the architecture building blocks. And so, again, each part of the continuum is supported by a different part, but it's the solution space. And what I find, interestingly enough, when it comes right down to practice in the state of industry, or the state of practice in most organizations, is that while TOGAF talks a lot about this whole architecture building block stuff, I don't see any evidence that hardly anybody does this. What I see is I see a lot of people doing this, which isn't bad. It's just a reflection, I think, of the level of maturity, which is, if we just go back to the previous slide, or a previous slide, like right here, this is a technology reference model, a way of categorizing technology architecture assets, yet all of them, or any of them, actually architecture things? No, they're all solution things. So what I find is that organizations that are trying to get more mature with this start really from the bottom of the stack and move up. And I think that's reasonable because things that are concrete and real, I think, are a lot more relevant and pertinent to end-user organizations, and it's really tough for people to get their brains around what it means to manage an architecture building block that's based solely on standard and specification. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, there are opportunities for moving forward and making that a little bit more, raising the value proposition by really trying to do architecture management at the architecture level as opposed to the solution level. One of the other things that's kind of interesting that I thought about when I was, comparing reference models and architecture to the enterprise continuum is one way, at least in my interpretation, we can think of the left side of the enterprise continuum is really more reference modeling, if that's an adverb, and the things that are on the right are more reference architecture. And somewhere in between, some transition occurs where things become, actual reference architectures and become less reference models, which is an interesting idea about are reference architectures or reference models actually the same thing, but just expressed differently given on levels of maturity and what they're being used for. I don't think so, but it's an interesting thing to throw out here with the enterprise continuum. So some of you guys may be familiar with the idea of the architecture or the federated set of enterprise repositories that TOGAF talks about. This is, again, a great addition to TOGAF 9 that really subsumes the enterprise continuum as a primary structure for organizing all this architecture content. And just to point out real quick, we did modify this a little bit. This is an APG extension, just with a couple little additions. But the thing to be clear about is that, again, there's a lot of different things we need to keep track of in an architecture capability. And one of them is what TOGAF calls the standards information base, the SIB. And that's where architecture building blocks are supposed to go. But again, what I see in practice is that most people are focusing on solution building blocks, and that goes into the solutions repository. But one thing that we've added, and this is something that a couple other folks within the open group have been advocating for some time as well, is that as it relates to getting a complete line of sight across the entirety of the enterprise, we also need to throw in operations. So this would be the, so another word for the operations repository is the configuration management database, the CMDB. And again, a lot of the work that we do, we're trying to help clients triangulate stuff that's happening at the architecture level, the solution level, and the instance level of the runtime operations. And what I'm going to try to show you is a way that I think we can kind of unify that stuff all together. So we've got architecture building blocks in the SIB, solution building blocks in the solution repository, and this whole idea of OBDs, again, is something we've made up that could become a part of the standard sometime in the future. So here's a conceptual meta model of reference models. And I built this for Spark's Enterprise Architect. So we have the idea that a reference model, first of all, it's a model. That makes a lot of sense, but at least we're trying to semantically acknowledge that here. And it is related to a domain of interest. We suggest that a reference model may have different types. So this is the idea that it could be an ontology, a meta model, or a taxonomy. A reference model is comprised of a set of reference model elements, and the most frequent relationship that we see is this recursive decomposition. So the idea that areas are decomposed into categories, and categories are decomposed into components. Again, really focusing on a lot of times that taxonomy stuff, with the idea that a reference model also may optionally include a set of quality attributes. That is, it may be designed to accommodate a certain operational situation, and those quality attributes are a part of the reference model. The reference model elements, in addition to having some basic identifier information, we have an accommodation that within a single reference model we potentially may want to represent multiple levels of abstractions of elements. So that's the idea that they can be abstract elements, concrete, or actually instances. But then with respect to actually trying to set this up in tooling, another property that we want to know is that if it's abstract, there's a likelihood that we're not actually going to be using it as to assign elements to. Again, it's something that's a little bit higher up in the hierarchy that we're using to try to represent some shared properties. But we've decided that we really need to have an attribute to say, is this a reference model element to which you assign other things to? And is it a managed element? And so this is the whole idea that some reference model elements are managed, i.e. governed. So they have an owner, so some organization unit that's responsible for it, a person who's going to be helping lead the organization in planning and decision making, and the idea that a managed model element has a life cycle model, the idea that it is proposed, provisional, active, standard, contained, retired, and again, those would be representative life cycle states, and it has a current status. And then just to throw in there the idea that those model elements may have a set of quality attribute values. So if we get to the whole idea of that we need modifiability or scalability or so on and so forth as some of the quality attributes of the framework, we actually want to be able to quantify some empirical number that represents how that particular model element meets those quality attributes. But then to throw in just a little bit of TOGAF stuff, the whole idea that a certain type of managed model element might be a building block, and that there are 3 different types: architecture, solution, and operational. And then on the right-hand side, again, is really the whole idea, because we, generally speaking, I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a lot of time sitting around just to build reference. Well, I guess I don't. I had nothing to do for 5 hours on the plane, so. But the whole idea is we really usually don't build reference models just because we can. We build reference models because they're to be used for something. And that's the whole idea that users create content models for whatever purpose they're trying to represent. Again, the content model represents a relationship to one or many domains of interest. But when it comes to being related to a reference model, there's the idea that we need to understand how we're using that reference model. So we have the idea, this is not necessarily meant to be an exhaustive list, that we may be using this for mapping or doing categorization of elements, or we may be using it for doing gap analysis. We've got the idea that a content model element itself could also be managed. So for example, an actual technology component, like we saw in the previous example, is a managed component. It has a life cycle, Microsoft SQL Server 2008 release 2 versus IBM DB2 9.1. But some people also have, again, parts of their reference models are also managed as well. And then, of course, the idea that all these elements may have relationships to one another. So that's it about reference models. So now let's talk a little bit about reference architecture. So OASIS has a pretty, detailed description of this. Comes up with, what I think a lot of people really think of reference architecture about is really, I think, a collection of design patterns, often not a single design pattern, but really kind of a pattern language. Again, this should be something that's independent of technologies. The difference from reference models in that a reference model describes the concepts, but the reference architecture shows a more complete picture as it relates to how you use them. So again, it's really trying to get to the whole idea of a class of solutions, which makes a lot of sense for reference architecture. But you may be able to find them, again, at multiple levels of abstraction for different kinds of purposes. So there's a nice conceptual graphic in the OASIS reference model on the relationship between reference architecture and reference models, and I think this is, has been affirmed my view on this, but again, this is kind of high-level squishy stuff, so I want to have to do something you about or it's not good. So just to give some examples, here's a slight excerpt from the SOA reference architecture. The identification that there's a certain set of elements that are related to the reference model as it relates to service, visibility, so on and so forth, giving these specific names and semantics and specifying a certain set of relationships, with the idea that in your actual, your own architecture or design, you will substitute local elements to represent those things in your local view of you. Take a look at another reference architecture for SOA. This is from the Open Group, same kind of thing. We've got some layers. We've got this the identification within one of the layers. What are the elements? What's interesting about this is that as I started thinking about what a reference model really was in a reference architecture, this sure seems to be a reference model. It's identifying the things that are part of the domain and categorizing them. But that's all it's really doing. But then it goes on to then describe, well, there's this idea that we might want to configure and interrelate those different elements in our common language in a certain way to solve a certain kind of problem. So again, these are those same elements that are configured with relationships in the operational layer. And just as a quick reminder, because of the slide that's coming up, I presume people here are familiar with ISO IEC 42010, formerly known as IEEE 1471, about the whole idea about architecture description. And just because I'm running out of time, I'm not going to dwell on it, but the big difference that we've suggested is that a reference model is a model, but a reference architecture is an architecture description. And in fact, what we've decided, particularly when I look at how people like to use these things at multiple levels of abstraction, I came up with an idea that generically there's a thing called a reference configuration. And there are different types of reference configurations. Architecture configurations, design configurations, and implementation configurations. Because one of the things that we see, for example, is people using reference models to classify configuration items. So in CMDB, there's this whole idea that we have a hierarchy of CI types. That's a hierarchy, a reference model, just like everything else. Hopefully the reference architecture that's being used, or the reference model that's being used in implementation, is similar to what is being used in design as well as architecture. But then if we can think about the reference model really defines all of the bits. So this is the whole idea that a reference configuration contains, again, a set of reference configuration elements, but that they may in fact actually be reference model elements. So we're taking the building blocks that were identified in the reference model and just showing about how they're going to be interrelated to one another. And this is something that we see not just happening at the architecture level, but also at the implementation level. So if someone says, hey, I need some servers and disk storage and network stuff, instead of pulling stuff off the list of menu items, you basically say, hey, I need something that can support this number of transactions, this number of this response time, this kind of protocol, and then IT service management says, well, we have a configuration of IT assets that can support that and provide that out of the box. And then again, lastly, just showing how this stuff is related to our actual content model. So conclusions is that basically reference models are used to represent the properties of the elements that are in the domain, including relationships, but reference architectures really represent configurations of those reference model elements. And again, you think of that as a pattern language. And then we can map those content model elements to both the models for organizing and then talk about how they can be configured for reference architecture. So that's what I had. Sorry for the density of content, fast pace. So thanks so much for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you.